Hello, my name is Elizabeth Nosek. I'm the Curator of Education and Exhibits for the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today I have a treat for you. We just completed a really special exhibit entitled Colorado Railroads and the Black Experience. I thought you might find it interesting to take a closer look at it with me. I want to thank my co-curator, Dr. George June, Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Northern Colorado. Neither the exhibit nor this Small Wonders episode would have been possible without him. This exhibit looks beyond our traditional Pullman Porter exhibit to the close relationship between America's railroads and the Black community. In fact, you don't have to look very far in an African American family to find an ancestor or two who worked for the railroad. Whoopi Goldberg and Mayor Wellington Webb are just two examples. Without these men and women, the railroads could not have operated. In turn, railroads offered African Americans great opportunities even though they came with huge obstacles that had to be overcome. Let's start with the section called Smiling on the Railroad. The first African Americans to work for the railroads did so before the Civil War. They were slaves. While some railroads owned their own slaves, others leased slaves or used slaves owned by the construction companies that were contracted to do the work. After the official end of slavery, the South developed a convict leasing system using prisoners for railroad construction. Many of these people were Black and found themselves put into the system through unfair vagrancy laws. This enabled the powerful white society to control Black labor and force them to work in low-paying jobs. Along with new immigrants, African Americans undertook much of the back-breaking work done by brakemen, firemen, maintenance of way work, and gandy dancers. They also found work in the shops and railroads as blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons. Following the Civil War, a new opportunity presented itself when George Pullman was inspired to design a sleeping car and then a dining car for passenger travel. In fact, Pullman's hotel car revolutionized the passenger car business. Not only did George Pullman build his hotel cars, he also operated them. And to do this, he needed to find a supply of workers who could offer exceptional service for low cost. He turned to ex-house slaves, seeing them as uniquely qualified to provide this excellent service on his hotel and dining cars. These men shined shoes, changed beds and linens, brushed lint from clothing, sprinkled deodorizer, and took down beds with special keys they kept in their pockets. There were porter maids too. These Black women gave manicures, did hair, and took care of their passengers' children. Other men served as waiters and chefs, serving passengers such as Ronald Reagan and singer Kate Smith. One of my favorite objects in the exhibit is the dining chimes that were played to call passengers to dinner. The company even provided specific music for the purpose. Porters worked up to 20 hours a day for very little pay and depended on passenger tips to feed their families. One of the more demeaning traditions these men were subjected to was the passengers' habit of calling their porter George. This followed the Southern tradition of calling slaves by their masters' names. George Pullman, in this case. Porters subtly protested by carrying cards saying, "My name is not George." Even with the racist behavior Pullman porters had to endure, this was one of the most prestigious jobs a Black person might have. It allowed them to travel across the country, meeting movie stars, politicians, and everyday Americans. In fact, it was not unusual for a porter to have a college degree. No matter how hard they worked, how unfair the working conditions, or how overqualified they were for the job they were doing, one rule remained the same for all African Americans working on the railroad: keep a smile on your face. Case 2 in the exhibit is entitled Standing Up, and it discusses how African American railroad workers stood up for their rights and inspired future generations to do so as well. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, African Americans faced countless challenges. Black railroad workers were no exception, enduring long hours of hard work, poor working conditions, and low pay that their white colleagues did not. While their white counterparts ate in restaurants, black railroad workers brought food from home in case they couldn't find a place to eat. Certain jobs, such as passenger car conductors, were simply not open to them. Yet these men and women were well-traveled and many were well-educated. They passed the news from across the country back to their people at home. In 1925, A. Philip Randolph organized the first African-American labor union, called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, to try to improve the situation. Other workers pursued justice in the courts, and some, such as those pictured here around 1917 in the Five Points neighborhood, took to the streets to protest. These men and women helped to lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1960s and today's Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, A. Philip Randolph stood with Martin Luther King behind the president and received one of the pens used to sign the document from the president's hand. Many people were involved in the effort of achieving civil rights. One of them was Winfred Seymour. A native Coloradoan, Seymour grew up in Pueblo, Colorado. His family owned a local newspaper and ranched. Between 1940 and 1986, Seymour worked for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and later for the Colorado and Southern. He started as a chair car attendant, keeping his tips in these 2 leather purses and using these key sets that are here on display. He rose to the rank of a conductor because he moved over to working freight trains, hauling coal, wheat, and Coors beer on the Denver to Pueblo run. He was able to be a conductor because it was a freight train and not a passenger train. Like many workers, Seymour joined the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a member of Local 202 in Denver. He was elected and served as the International Secretary-Treasurer of the Union for 10 years, 1971 to 1980, and worked with A. Philip Randolph. In fact, this Xerox is a letter Seymour received from A. Philip Randolph thanking him for his good work. Now we also have seals used for the Union and the Women's Auxiliary. One of the lesser-known parts of this story is that it was the wives of the porters and waiters who met and organized the Union, it being too dangerous for their husbands to be seen supporting the Union. And Mrs. Seymour, Winfred's wife, had her own college degree and was an accountant. It was she who kept the books for her husband when he was the treasurer. And this ledger is where she recorded members' dues. Over the course of his career as a chair car attendant and later freight train conductor, Winfred Seymour experienced the racism endured by African Americans firsthand. He took advantage of opportunities to better the working conditions of African Americans working for the railroad and strove to make the world a better place for his children. Case 3, Moving On Up, explores how railroad workers used their railroad experience to move up the social ladder into the middle class. The first African American railroad workers came to Colorado from Georgia and established a community with their families on 22nd Street. It became known as the Deep South, and by the 1920s, more than 90% of Denver's African American community resided within the Five Points and adjacent Whittier neighborhoods. Workers were lodged at the Glenarm YMCA in rooms leased by the railroad, and others brought their families to Denver and established homes. While these men and women depended on the railroad for their livelihood, they also used the opportunities railroad work presented to pursue their own American dreams. The Five Points neighborhood in Denver reflects these efforts. Former railroad workers like Otha Rice, Leroy Smith, David Mallard, and William Coker went into a variety of businesses that helped their families to move up the economic ladder. As you see, the histories of America's railroads and the Black community are so closely intertwined as to be impossible to separate. In fact, without these men and women, the railroads could not have operated. For their part, railroads offered African Americans great opportunities and huge obstacles to be overcome as these Americans pursued their American dreams. I hope you will visit the museum's exhibit, Colorado Railroads in the Black Experience, for yourself. It will be featured here in our upper gallery until late fall of 2021.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.